Also, another important one, which we've seen as a department that it's problematic, is gratuities. Your tips, your bonuses, your gifts. Also, that should not be included as part of national minimum wage when an employer is calculating the national minimum wage for an employee.
At DeL Podcast, your auditory experience on employment and labor news.
From the 1st of March 2026, the national minimum wage increased. Now, if you're an employer, or you may be asking, what exactly must I change on payroll? Or if you're a worker, you may be asking as well, what am I entitled to? And what if I'm still paid below the minimum wage? Therefore, today, we are breaking down for you. Clearly, with our guest, Ms. Unathi Ramabulana here next to me from the Department of Employment and Labor. We'll be talking to her about those particular issues. But let me also welcome you, our valued follower and client, to the DeL Podcast, which is brought to you by the Department of Employment and Labor. And for those who don't know me, my name is DeL and I'm the host of the DeL Podcast. Now, in this episode in particular, we'll focus specifically on national minimum wage increase that became binding from the 1st of March 2026. Now, that is very, very important. Now, Ms. Unathi Ramabulana, welcome to DeL Podcast. We are very happy to have you. I hope you are happy to be with us as well. You may say hi to our viewers.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, T. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. Now, in our endeavor to unpack the changes, because some people might have seen our post on social media talking about these changes, indicating how much this minimum wage is. Now, annually this changes and we publish it. So, what we'd like to find out from our guest today is the key elements and key figures that I'm going to really outline and give to you. You might be aware that as of March 2026, the national minimum wage is 30 rands 23 cents per ordinary hour worked. Now, this applies equally to farm workers and domestic workers. Workers on expanded public works program also fall under a special dispensation, and their minimum wage is 16 rand 62 cents per hour. There are also updated learnership allowances in Schedule 2. Now, the question is, what does it mean in practice? And we're going to get into it with our guest, Ramabulana. So that's the context of our podcast today. Maybe to start off, let me just shoot and ask you this question. Exactly, as of 1st of March 2026, what has changed? And, what does this mean? And who does it apply to? You can just give us that broad picture.
Thank you so much, T. So, as you mentioned in your opening, from the 1st of March 2026, the national minimum wage has been adjusted to 30 rands 32 cents. And that means, therefore, that employers should now be paying the new prescribed rate.
Okay.
So, in terms of the Act applies to all workers in South Africa, including domestic workers and farm workers.
Okay.
But there's a few exclusions, like your members of the South African National Defence Force, Intelligence Agency, Secret Services, as well as volunteers. Volunteers, the people that are not entitled to be paid or to receive remuneration.
Okay. Right. That's good. Now, you've also answered a couple of the questions that I wanted to ask. Now, as a worker, on my pay slip, in terms of the national minimum wage, what should I be looking for? What should I see to show that there is minimum wage on my pay slip?
So, as the department, what we're expecting, firstly, let's start with the employers. Okay. We're expecting that by now employers should have updated their payroll systems. and also adjusted the wages of workers to align with the new prescribed rate.
Okay.
And maybe if there's contracts already, they should have adjusted those contracts and ensure that they align with the policies to reflect the new prescribed rate. Now, for workers, we feel it's very important that they scrutinize their pay slips.
Okay.
Doing that ensures that they will be able to check whether in the pay slip is the new prescribed rate reflected. Secondly, the hours that are in the pay slip that are recorded are the hours that they have worked in that particular month. And also, are there no unlawful deductions that have been made on their salaries? Because remember, if there's any unlawful deduction on the pay slip, then it will affect the national minimum wage that they are getting at the end of the month. So are all the things that we feel employers should have done as also and workers. But I think I need to indicate that for employers, let's say there's an employer now that cannot afford to pay the national minimum wage. We're not expecting employers to just ignore the law or make private arrangements with employees to pay less. But an employer that cannot afford to pay the national minimum wage must apply for an exemption through the department. And what I need to stress is the fact that an exemption is not an automatic thing that you get.
Okay, just because I don't have
Just
money.
because you don't have money. So it must be proven. So an employer needs to provide proof that genuinely the employer cannot afford to pay the national minimum wage.
Okay.
So by now we're expecting that employers should have done all the adjustments and made sure that the wages of the workers are aligning with the new prescribed rate.
Okay, so just that doesn't mean that, I want to save money so I can't pay them.
No.
Can I deduct maybe, if I'm giving them accommodation, if I'm buying them some toiletries and whatever, and I'm giving them some bonuses, can I deduct that money from national minimum wage?
So in the Act, there's specific things that should not be deducted or should not be added when an employer is calculating. Remember, an employer will say, already I'm paying food, already I'm paying accommodation. Then can I include that when I'm calculating the 30 rands 23 cents, for instance? So what the Act provides is that there are things that are provided by the employer to enable a worker to perform work.
Yes.
Transport, for instance, some employers are providing transport for a worker to go to work. Tools of trade, equipment, food, and
PPE.
accommodation, PPE. So those things are not to be included when an employer is calculating the national minimum wage, unless there's a sectoral determination that provides otherwise.
Okay.
Also, another important one, which we've seen as a department that it's problematic, is gratuities. Your tips, your bonuses, your gifts. Also, that should not be included as part of national minimum wage when an employer is calculating the national minimum wage for an employee. But there's another thing, T, that sometimes comes up. Because remember, a calculation of a national minimum wage is based on ordinary hours.
Yes.
So an employee might ask, what if I'm not paid by hours? I'm paid by commission, I'm paid by task.
For the part-time and irregular hours.
Exactly. So what happens is that the Act is very specific to indicate that if an employee is paid on another basis other than the ordinary hours, that employee should at least get the national minimum wage.
Perfect.
Doesn't matter, anything can be an edit, but as long as that flow is always aligned with.
Well, that's interesting because we've also dealt with the issue of irregular hours and what have you. But, there's some people who will be saying, you know what, your employer or government said we must pay you the national minimum wage. What is the national minimum wage? What is the difference in your view between national minimum wage and living wage? Is there a difference?
There is a difference, T. There is a difference because remember, if you will recall during the discussions at NEDLEC around the introduction of national minimum wage, there was a call for a living wage. There is a difference in a sense that a national minimum wage is not a living wage. It's a basic, it's the floor. So it's the floor by which constituencies now at NEDLEC, whether it's bargaining councils, can work on that as a benchmark to say we can aim for more than what the floor level is in terms of the national minimum wage.
No, that's quite interesting, and I think that is very helpful for us. But now, maybe just go into another interesting question. You've given us a background on the national minimum wage. Now, South Africa obviously has introduced national minimum wage. Before, back in the day, maybe before some of us were even born when we were still young, people have been paid differential amounts. Now, what was the reason behind? What is this national minimum wage trying to address?
So, if we let's take it back now. You will recall, T, that before the introduction of national minimum wage, which was in 2019, wages in South Africa were regulated on a sector-by-sector basis through a combination of bargaining council agreements as well as sectoral determinations. While that system worked perfectly, it served an important purpose, but there were structural gaps aligned with that system. Firstly, I talked about bargaining councils. Bargaining councils were only covering sectors or workers in sectors where unions and employers are organized. Similarly, with sectoral determinations, as you will recall, that we had sectoral determination for domestic, for farm. Sectoral determinations only applied to specific sectors. Now, that meant that 1 million workers that were not part of those sectoral determinations or those bargaining councils were left vulnerable with extremely low wages. Also, like if you look at your small businesses, your emerging sectors and your informal economy, a lot of them didn't have bargaining councils, didn't have sectoral determination. Secondly, there was no baseline, national baseline in terms of who must get what. And we realized also that the system was highly fragmented in a sense that there was different wages for different sectors. And some workers, even though you find that a worker is doing the same work as another particular worker, but they were not paid the same. So looking at all those structural gaps, then the national minimum wage was introduced. And the reason why it was introduced was to firstly improve the wages of the lowest paid worker. Domestic workers and farm workers had sectoral determinations before. But when you look at the levels of those wages, they were very low. So the national minimum wage was firstly upskilling those wages to a more better basic income level that workers can be able to afford the basic needs. Secondly, to ensure that there's a national baseline now, so that no one in South Africa will be paid less than that. Another important thing that I need to clear out is the fact that, you know, in terms of the other labor laws, like your Labor Relations Act, your Basic Conditions of Employment Act, we've always said that it applies to employees. The national minimum wage came and said it applies to workers. And some people don't know that there's a difference
between a worker and
an employee. The difference is that with the employee, Basic Conditions of Employment Act covers an employee, but it doesn't cover an independent contractor. That is a person that just works for himself or herself. With the national minimum wage, it covers also an independent contractor. Hence, I'm always talking about a worker, because when we're talking of national minimum wage, we're always referring to a worker with that understanding that we wanted to even ensure that we include the disguised employment, where there won't be any issues whether a person is an employee or a what. So we included to say it applies now to a worker, to ensure that it covers all types of work practices that might be there in South Africa. So now the national minimum wage just came as a benchmark. Which now we also always try, because some people will ask, but is that not going to undermine collective bargaining? Because you've indicated, Unathi, that the wild bargaining councils and sectoral determination. So what does it mean? It's a benchmark, but it's not stopping bargaining councils that are organized from negotiating with the employer for better wages than what the basic provides.
No, absolutely. Because I also heard that if a sectoral determination is greater than the national minimum wage, that takes precedence, which basically means you are not supposed to be paying national minimum wage even though the work scope of that particular person requires more. So don't pay below, but pay what is requisite to the job that the person is doing. Now, quickly, just on a question that just came to mind, let's say given the national minimum wage now, so if I get a piece job, let me call it that, then I only work for 1 hour. Am I only getting that 30 rand, 60, or how am I getting paid?
Thank you. That's a very good question, because it's a new provision that was added to protect vulnerable workers. Maybe let me start with this. The national minimum wage, how we calculate, because people always ask, is it an hourly rate? Is it a monthly salary? So it's specifically set as an hourly rate.
Oh.
And the reason for that, I'm remembering that because you mentioned it when you started in the beginning for the irregular work arrangements and type of stores. So the reason why the national minimum wage is set as an hourly rate is to ensure that there's fairness also for the flexible working arrangements, for the irregular working arrangements, because if it's a monthly salary, then those ones won't be covered.
Sure.
So
Sure.
Another section that was a provision, which is what you just asked now, that was included, was the fact that now there's a minimum payment of 4 hours that has been introduced. It's an amendment. Remember, when we introduced the National Minimum Wage Act, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act was also amended to align with the National Minimum Wage Act. Now, there's a provision there that was included to say there's a minimum payment of 4 hours, meaning that if a worker works for 1 hour, 2 hours, that worker still has to be paid at least for 4 hours. You may ask why that provision, why was it introduced? Remember the sectors where you find that workers already would have pitched at work.
Yes.
They are at work, but due to, let's say, bad weather, inclement weather, or a breakage of machinery, now the worker is sent home. Other workers are sometimes called for short shifts like 1 hour, 2 hours. So in order to protect those workers, to ensure that at least they get a minimum level of income, then that provision was introduced, meaning that already they have availed themselves for work. But for whatever reason, which sometimes is not at their fault, like a breakage of machinery, they need to be compensated for at least 4 hours. So there's that provision that is included in there.
That's important. Now I'm empowered. I will explain this to my clients as they ask me these questions. As we are closing to an end, let me just remind our viewers on some figures. We said from March 2026, the national minimum wage is 30 rands 23 cents per hour, per ordinary hour worked. And this applies equally to farm workers and domestic workers. Workers on the expanded public works program fall under a special dispensation, and their minimum wage is 16 rand 62 cents per hour. There are also updated learnerships allowances in Schedule 2 as we've indicated. Now, let's help, as we conclude, let's help the employers in particular. Now, some sectors have specific wage tables linked to sectoral determinations, as you mentioned. How should employers and workers approach these tables without getting confused?
Yes, that's a very good question. So you'll recall, T, that I indicated earlier that when the national minimum wage was introduced in 2019, already we had sectoral determinations that were regulating conditions as well as minimum wages. There were sectoral determinations, I think we had 10 at the time. So there were those ones that their wages already were higher than the rate of the national minimum wage at its promulgation, such as your contract cleaning sector, wholesale and retail sector, your learnership. So to avoid their wages lagging behind every time the national minimum wage is increased, so a provision was inserted to say each time the national minimum wage is increased, those sectoral determinations should also increase proportional to that percentage that the national minimum wage will increase. Hence, you see that when you're publishing the Gazette, you will find that there's a general minimum wage, but then there's a wage for contract cleaning, because remember, at the time, already it was above the rate of the national minimum wage. So to make sure to protect them, because employers sometimes can say, no, are we still very far from the national minimum wage? So then it was indicated that every time it adjusts, then the wages of those sectoral determinations must adjust as well. So that's why then there's that difference. Now, we always tell employers that then what it means is that if you know you are an employer in a wholesale and retail industry, then when you go to the Gazette, you will look for the wages under the table of wholesale and retail industry.
As a guide.
As a guide. But again, we've had questions from domestic workers, for instance, to say, as the department, you've introduced the national minimum wage. So what happens to the sectoral determination? The sectoral determination is still there. Remember, the sectoral determination regulated both wages and conditions. But because of the national minimum wage, then that part of wages now is regulated by National Minimum Wage Act. But the conditions of employment, which might be your leave, your hours of work, are still regulated by your sectoral determination. So you still have to look at both the sectoral determination and the national minimum wage if you are an employer.
Perfect. Like we said, whichever is greater, take precedence. Now that's important. And we must also remind our viewers that worker rights are actually human rights. and we should adhere to those rights and make sure that everyone is paid as per the sectoral determination or national minimum wage or the scope of work that they're actually doing. We can talk up until the cows come back home when you talk to Mayor Ramabulana here. Then we'll invite you again so that we can give more to our viewers in terms of this national minimum wage. But what is important is if you are paid below the national minimum wage, you can visit your nearest CCMA office for assistance or the nearest labor center to you to report to the inspectors for them to look into that particular challenge. For today, we call it a very beautiful day. Until we meet again, follow us on our social media. Also, catch us on our YouTube channel, the Department of Employment and Labor, and all the information that you might need on www.labor.gov.za. Till we meet, is a wrap.